Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Natalie, Stephen, Maria, Sean, and Figaro. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming a member of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. And because you supported in the month of July, you and everyone else who becomes a subscriber through Patreon or drops us a one-time tip via buymeacoffee.com will be entered into a giveaway at the end of the month, the prize for which is an exclusive episode of Boring Books for Bedtime made just for you. And you get to choose the book, so copyright restrictions do not apply. You'll find links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the show description. Thank you so much to all of our supporters, and best of luck. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's relax and sleep with a bit of how-to from the Handbook on Cheesemaking by George E. Newell. First published in 1889 by the Michigan Dairymen, Grand Rapids, Michigan, and printed by the press of Fuller and Stowe Company. Let's begin. Preface. This little work on cheese manufacture is inscribed to makers, dealers, and consumers in the hope that its careful perusal may be of aid to one and all. The prestige that American cheese holds in the markets of the world has been threatened from many quarters, but we who inaugurated the cheddar system on this side of the Atlantic are not prepared to succumb to competition, however sharp, or to prejudice, however strong. American cheese will hold its own as long as it has a square quality basis to stand upon. We possess the most natural and privileged dairy regions on earth. Let us utilize to their fullest extent the great advantages within our grasp. Dairymen have of late been struck with consternation by the ascendancy of Canadian cheese over the state's product. The dairy press have been pounding away at the gruesome situation so vigorously that many cheesemen have been frightened into the belief that Canada has a corner on gilt-edged quality and fancy quotations that is liable to continue indefinitely. The writer has no such apprehension and sees no reason why an American cheese should not always be a peer of the best. There has been unanimous action all over the dairy portions of the Dominion to effect the slight advantage they now hold. If, in a strenuous endeavor to improve the product, our friends across the border have succeeded, and at the same time have stimulated us to a like movement, then thanks be to them. Legitimate competition aids all mankind. As the caption indicates, this treatise is from the pen of a practical maker who analyzes cheese manufacture from a standpoint of practice and experience, and not theory. In elucidating to my readers the fundamental and collateral fabric of milk manufacture, I write from the desk of a cheese factory, with milk, utensils, and product under my immediate and daily supervision. In these pages I shall discard everything theoretic and base the whole value of the book on its practicability. In doing so, my constant thought shall be the elevation and supremacy of American cheese to the highest standard attainable. To this manual I especially invite the criticism of the cheese profession in general, trusting that it may be a convenient book of reliable reference to the experienced and a work of utility to the novice. George E. Newell, Leonardsville, New York. The factory building and site. The site for a cheese factory should be a well-drained, slightly elevated location, convenient to a copious and perpetual flow of water. The size of the building is, of course, to be measured by the amount of milk to be manufactured therein, but the same internal arrangement is needed alike in both small and large factories. The building should rest on a substantial stone foundation, with a free circulation of air underneath, and a complete system of troughs be appendant to carry all slops and whey beyond contaminating distance. It is unnecessary that the building be more than a story and a half high, unless the upper apartment is required for something besides curing cheese. The make room should be sealed and the curing room plastered. The make room should be in the front of the building, with the engine room on one side of it and the milk delivery window on the other. The curing room should be in the back. Cut off all superfluous space about the building and have just enough room to be nicely convenient. Put an awning roof over the delivery window, wide and long enough to cover wagon and team. Set the vats broadside to the milk scales, with ends towards the outer door. The platform for the weighing can and scales should be on a level with the top of the vats. A small office desk should be hung to the wall near the weigh can, and close at hand so that every patron can see them should be arranged the cream tubes and lactometer. Tin utensils can be hung on pegs in the wall, and a stout low shelf in one corner will support rennet and anatoine jars. Have the aisle between the vats wide enough to permit of easy passage, and at the farther end of the vats sink a trough into the floor to carry off the whey. Have similar troughs under the presses. The floor should be full enough in the center to gravitate all slop toward the drains. It is useless to have a factory floor wet all of the time. Keep it dry by a system of neatness. The curing room should have an outside door from which cheese can be loaded. An adjoining lean-to shed for storing empty cheese boxes and housing fuel is also a needed addition to the building. For a one-day milk delivery factory, no ice house is required. Build substantially and paint neatly, aiming to have a model-looking factory. Beginning of the cheese factory system in America. About the year 1853, a gentleman residing near Rome, Oneida County, New York, Jesse Williams by name, conceived the idea of manufacturing his neighbor's milk in common with his own. This is the first known instance of manufacture in this country by associated dairies, although the method was previously in vogue in Switzerland. I quote from an old report. It required a long time to create the demand which now exists in England for American cheese, and to Herkimer County, New York, belongs the credit of creating it and securing the trade. It was mainly effected by bringing a high degree of skill to bear upon the manufacture generally, thus producing not only a good article, but uniformly good, or as near uniform as is possible when made in different families. Cheese had been sent abroad in small amounts for many years, but when once by good quality and uniformity it had secured a firm foothold, the amount exported increased with astonishing rapidity. By gradual growth it had come to 9 million pounds in 1859. In 1860 it amounted to 23 millions, in 1861 to 40 millions, and the demand and supply have steadily increased ever since. It is a noteworthy fact that systematic attempts to improve the manufacture of cheese began to be made both in Somersetshire, England, and in Herkimer County, New York, about the same time, and also that with no knowledge on the part of either of the progress made by the other, after lengthened experiments, both should have adopted substantially the same method, for it is a fact that the Cheddar and Herkimer methods so closely resemble each other that the only differences of any consequence are such as necessarily grow out of the difference of climate. Their process differs from most methods mainly in two particulars. First, in employing milk which has attained a proximate degree of acidity, although never enough to be sensible to the taste, instead of such as is quite new. And second, in the separation of the whey from the curd by causing its contraction and precipitation instead of depending mainly on mechanical means. The improvements thus introduced within a comparatively recent period have resulted in several important advantages. First, a material reduction of labor. Second, the production of a larger amount and a better quality of cheese from a given quantity of milk. And lastly, the cheese made by this method requires less time for the ripening process and thus is sooner ready for the market. Utensils necessary to stock a factory. A boiler of moderate capacity with fittings complete. Milk vats with steam pipes and connections. Patent galvanized iron cheese hoops. A gang press. Whey can with large gate. Milk conductor to convey the lacteal fluid from the whey can to the cloth strainer over the vat. Common-sized scales that will weigh at least 600 pounds. Small-sized scales for weighing cheese. 2 curd knives, one with horizontal and the other with perpendicular blades. Large wheel with crank and endless rope for hoisting milk. 2 stone rennet jars of a capacity of 10 gallons each. 2 thermometers, one for the make and the other for the curing room. Jar for keeping anatoine. Siphon and tin strainer for drawing whey from the vat. A self-salting curd mill. A curd mill is now indispensable to a factory, and a self-salting one is indispensable where only one man is employed. Rubber mop, curd broom, and floor broom. milk book for keeping accurate account of all business transacted in the establishment, including daily receipts of milk from patrons, a set of glass tubes in a case for testing milk as to the amount of cream it contains and comparing its state of maturity, 2 water pails and 1 curd pail, a heavy curd scoop, 2 dippers, one of 3 and the other of 6 quarts capacity, glass graduated jar, and lactometer for testing milk to locate water. Be sure and purchase a lactometer gauged for trying milk at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, many being gauged for 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and of little use in hot weather unless you have ice handy to chill the milk designed for the test. Stencils, case, and brush for dating cheese, and branding boxes. Tin funnel for conveying whey from the vat to the outside tank. Curd rake for agitating the product when cooking. A cheese trier. A curd sink is not now strictly essential, although some makers still prefer to use one. In glancing over the above list, we will mention some of the articles that can be supplemented by utensils of a more primitive and cheaper make. Such a retrograde change is not, however, desirable, although sometimes in a small factory, where the receipts to the manufacturer are limited, strict economy has to be practiced in order to leave a margin of profit. With economists of necessity, the boiler can be discarded, and an old-fashioned underheater vat with a hot water tank attached made to do service. I know of dozens of small factories throughout central New York who get along admirably with such apparatus. In the matter of press and hoops, you can do better without the gang press than you can without the patent hoops. Remember that it is no economy to go back to the primitive hoop that makes necessary the hand bandaging of every cheese. If obliged to go without the gang press, get hoops that can be bandaged before the curd is put in them, so that 2 cheese can be pressed under 1 screw in an old-fashioned press. In such a case, wooden followers would be required. 1 pair of scales can be got along with at a pinch, although 2 pairs would save a great deal of transferring and extra work. Do not get along with 1 curd knife. You need both the horizontal and the perpendicular in order to cut the raw curd evenly and economically. A crane can take the place of a large wheel for hoisting milk if you consider it more convenient. Keep rennet in nothing but stone jars or vessels, and keep at least 10 gallons always prepared ahead. Jugs are often used for anatoine, although an open jar admits of easy dipping and accurate measurement. Have your tinner make you a long, narrow gill cup, to which should be soldered an upright 6-inch handle with a shepherd's crook in the end. Use the cup for measuring out the coloring. The long handle, which can be hung by the crook on the inside of the jar, precludes soiling the hands, clothing, and floor with the scarlet dye. A curd mill of some sort is positively necessary in order to facilitate good even stock. Do not leave one out of the list of apparati under any consideration. I prefer a self-salting mill, not only on account of the ease with which curd can be ground, but also for its superior mechanism in thoroughly mixing the salt into the curd as fast as it is torn by the teeth. In grinding curd with a common machine, the torn shreds quickly reamalgamate into an almost solid mass that often requires harsh manipulation to separate. Then again, the salt being sprinkled by hand over the outer surface of the freshly torn curd sears and burns it before it can be worked into the mass. With a self-salter, the saline condiment is equally distributed through all parts at the proper limit of acid formation, thus preventing the curd from packing solidly and making the quality even and fine. Manufacture of cheese. Coagulation of milk. If the milk you have in your vat is mature, or in other words slightly tending toward sour, heat it as rapidly as possible when preparing for the application of rennet. In the cool extremes of the season, heat milk to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and in warm weather to 85 degrees before rennet is applied. If the milk is all right as to sweetness, as the bulk of milk is, heat it up to the desired point gradually, stirring it gently at frequent intervals with a long-handled dipper. You stir for the purpose of keeping down the cream and evenly distributing the warmth that is permeating the lacteal mass. You stir it with great gentleness and care, because milk globules are eggs in miniature, and like their large relatives of biped production, they must be handled with care. If you wish to heat to 85 degrees and have an underheater vat or fire flue beneath the milk, withdraw the fire before it has quite reached that point, as the after warmth will carry it up a degree or two. Be perfectly precise in all such little points, for on them hinge big results. With milk in normal condition as to maturity, standing at a temperature of 85 degrees in both ends of the vat, and with no cream visible on the surface, you are ready to take another step in the course of manufacture. If colored cheese is desired, now apply anatoine sufficient to give a rich golden hue. Know exactly by experiment its strength as a dye. Always know the quantity of milk to a pound and portion out accordingly. Work the coloring into the fluid with the same gentleness with which you have heretofore manipulated it while raising the temperature. When the milk is all of one even yellow tinge, attesting that the annatto is represented equally in every part, it is ready for the real inceptor of cheese, rennet. The tendency of modern cheese making is toward quick coagulation of milk. The larger infusion of rennet necessary for this purpose begets cheese that can be quickly cured for a market where they are expected to be soon consumed. The old rule of coagulation in 20 minutes is now nearly obsolete, although it will always hold good for cheese of long-keeping qualities. Fall-made cheese that are expected to be consumed during the winter months should be strengthened for age by coagulation in from 15 to 18 minutes. When we are dealing with the average spring and summer make, trade demands more perishable stock, and we must cater to it. If you do not know the strength of your rennet, and you want the milk to thicken in 8 or 9 minutes, as it should do, previously test the lactic juice by putting a teaspoonful into a tumbler of milk kept warm at 85 degrees. If the glass of fluid thickens in 5 minutes, you need 1 quart of such rennet juice for every 800 pounds of milk to effect coagulation as stated above. If the tested quantity thickens in less or longer time, a proportionate less or greater amount is required for your purpose. Measure the rennet extract with exactness so that there will be no miss in its proper adjustment to the milk, and then incorporate it into the vat of lacteal fluid. In infusing it into the milk structure, manipulate your dipper with the same caution that has characterized your former attitude toward the fragilely constructed fluid under your hand. After stirring for 5 minutes, withdraw the dipper and let the surface of the milk come to a calm. Then pass the bottom of the empty dipper lightly over the vat to drive back any particles of cream that may be struggling to the surface. The milk will soon begin to roll up in the wake of the tin utensil in your hand in a rapidly thickening wave. Immediately withdraw the dipper, for the rennet has accomplished its mission. Turning to your vat cover, stretch it tightly over the fermenting milk. The cover mentioned should consist of a strip of canvas cloth or sheeting running the entire length of the vat and lapping slightly over its width. The cloth should be tacked to lath or other light wooden strips the width of the vat, and these supports should be about 2 feet apart. When not in use, the cover can be rolled up like a section of carpeting and is not at all awkward to handle. Place the cover in a closed form on one end of the vat, and unrolling it as fast as you walk, you can stretch it to the other end in half a minute, thus keeping your milk snug and close. I prefer to use such a cover every day during the season, and they are indispensable in spring and fall. Without some such device, the crust of the rapidly forming curd is chilled, retarding the action of the rennet, and the temperature of the whole mass is perceptibly lowered, which is not only undesirable, but positively detrimental to the natural and perfect formation of cheese. In the course of 20 or 30 minutes after coagulation, examine your crude cheese material and see if it is ready to cut up. Thrust the forefinger into the mass, and if the curd will split cleanly in front of it, it is ready for the knives. Milk should stand about 45 minutes after the infusion of rennet before it is cut, but if the milk is very mature in quality, rennet will act on the casein more spontaneously. It may be firm enough to cut before that time. If, in such a case, the same amount of rennet had previously acted slowly on a proportionate quantity of milk, you can at once consider the quick action as a fair warning from nature that you must scald your curd in haste to keep ahead of the swiftly multiplying acid germs. As previously stated, as soon as the curd mass will cleave brittly over the finger, prepare your knives. First, pick up the one with horizontal blade and hold it a second in hot water. This will warm the steel so that it will not chill the curd. Cut the mass lengthwise, turning corners deftly without lifting the instrument once until you are through. Then lay this knife aside, for its work is done. Insert the perpendicular knife also in hot water, and with it cut the curd first crosswise, then lengthwise, then crosswise again, being sure to lap over the course of each cut. The curd is now in small cubes that are fast discharging whey from their severed cellular system. They gravitate toward the bottom of the vat. If the curd has been cleft by the blades, gently and with great care, The rising whey has a clear greenish cast, attesting that it is freed from most of the albuminous substances of the milk and will render a good ratio to the patrons. Scalding. If the milk was mature, or too much rennet was incorporated with perfectly sweet milk, the whey will separate from the solids very rapidly. In either case, it wants an immediate application of heat after cutting. Curd from fairly good milk with a proper infusion of rennet should stand for a few moments after cutting before heat is turned on. Never apply heat under any circumstances until the raw curd has all disappeared beneath the whey's surface. As soon as the heat has warmed the bottom of the vat, bare your arms and with the hands gently lift the new cut mass to the surface. In this lifting, give it a rolling motion so that the cubes will all fall apart and exchange positions with one another. Two dangers now arise, and you must be prepared to steer straight between them. First, as the heat comes surging up from beneath against the tin bottom of the vat, it makes it very hot below and cool on top. If the raw curd settles but a moment against the hot bottom, it is liable to be blistered and seared over, to the subsequent detriment of the whole mass. Of course, it needs a slow application of heat on the start and almost constant agitation. And here comes danger number 2. If you do not stir your curd sufficiently in heating, the quality of your goods is at stake. And if you do not stir judiciously, or stir too often and too harshly, your milk ratio is in jeopardy. By exercising good judgment, care, and caution, you can avoid the two extremes and make each danger your willing servant. If your milk on the start is sweet and pure, allow the heat to go up slowly until it touches the desired point. If, on the other hand, it is ripe, old, or sour, push the heat with all vigor and scald as quickly as possible. With milk all right, about 3/4 of an hour's time should be consumed in bringing up the heat to the scalding limit. But if otherwise, get it there in 15 minutes or half an hour, according to the exigency of the case. But to return to the subject of scalding a vat of curd in normal condition, on the start, using your hands as described, manipulate it with such care that the tender cubes are not bruised and yet are kept separate enough so that they will not form into a compact mass on the warm bottom. All this time, the whey is percolating from the blocks, and they are shrinking in size and becoming of tougher texture. As soon as the curd begins to assume a slightly elastic consistency, begin operations with a rake. If you have an idea that curd wants to be stirred all of the time throughout the scalding period, at once disabuse your mind of it. Such a notion is antediluvian in its conception and disastrous in its results. But strange to say, it is the predominating feature of the know-it-all young maker's knowledge. Novices at the business are sure to stir too often and too violently. This knocks off the yield and also injures the quality of the cheese. For myself, above all patent devices in the shape of wire rakes for agitating curd, I prefer a simple wooden hand hay rake. Get one made of wood throughout, and saw off the handle, leaving the stub about 4 feet long. This will ensure convenient handling. When the moment arrives in the early cooking departure to use the rake, take the utensil described and inserting its teeth up in the whey and curd, midway of the vat at one end, push it gently from you to within 2 inches of the farther edge, letting the back of the rake head slide on the bottom of the vat. Be sure and do not let the teeth and head of the agitator hit the side of the vat, as curd is pushed before it, which does not want the substance and nutriment crushed out of it that way. As the rake approaches the side of the vat, give it an easy, undulating upward swing, ending by a draw of the rake toward you. This will cause the curd that you have been pushing from you along the bottom of the vat to boil up with the whey in the wake of the retreating rake. If the motion has been gone through with easily and carefully, you will at once see that the curd within the rake's sweep has been thoroughly agitated without bruising. After the maneuver described, do not change position, but drawing the rake toward you, with its head scraping the bottom of the vat, produce a gentle ebullition of curd and whey in the same way as that just manifested. Step along, repeating the pushing and drawing of the rake until the farther end of the vat is reached. Then push the curd with the rake up on one side and down on the other of the vat, changing ends as it were with the cooking cheese. Once over a vat in this way, if accomplished properly, thoroughly separates the curd particles and evens up the heat through the whole mass. Now let the rake rest, but have the heat go on for a few moments. When the curd begins to pack slightly, perhaps in 5 minutes more or less, according to the previous maturity of the milk, again stir it up in the manner described, and again let it rest, repeating the periods of agitation until it is scalded up to the desired temperature. In regard to the right temperature at which to scald cheese, we cannot hope to give on paper much more than superficial information. Every phase of cheesemaking, to be thoroughly understood, requires practical experience, but hints and pointers on paper are often just what are needed to help puzzled ones out of awkward dilemmas encountered in the business. Hence we shall, in the most clear and logical manner possible, give the reader our views, derived from experience, on scalding temperature. The right temperature. In the spring of the year, hay-produced milk is comparatively poor and thin. When it reaches the manufacturer's hands, it is generally as sweet as a rose in regard to acid, although not always so in regard to stable tang. When it has been transformed into curd, it must be scalded high enough to cook it, whether that takes a temperature of 98 degrees, 100 degrees, or 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Don't think, as some do, that the curd is cooked when it has reached the temperature you are using. Generally, it is not more than half cooked then. We will say you began making cheese on the first day of April. You are not an expert at the business, and being anxious to make a good beginning, feel a trifle nervous over the situation. Keep cool and bring the temperature of the curd up to 100 degrees. On reaching this heat, immediately cover up the vat with the carpet-like canopy previously described. Be sure and give it a thorough rake stirring the last thing on reaching the scalding point. If the make room is reasonably warm, the canvas roof will keep the whey at a mercurial heat of 100 degrees for a long while. After a few minutes, examine the curd and see how it is progressing. Stir it up occasionally. Once in 15 minutes or so is sufficient, and after it has stood an hour and a half at 100 degrees, if it does not squeak sharply between the teeth when chewed, or immediately fall apart when squeezed dry of whey in a double handful, you may be assured that 100 degrees was too low a temperature at which to cook it. The object is to cook at the lowest temperature which will do the business within a reasonable time. The higher the temperature used, the quicker it will be cooked, but it will require more milk to make a pound of cheese. A good yield and a good quality must both be gotten out of the milk. These are fine points in cheese making. The curd we have spoken of has stood in the whey at 100 degrees for 1 hour and a half and is yet insufficiently cooked. An hour longer at the same temperature would probably cook it to the right degree, but there are objections to letting curd stand in the whey so long. It gets whey-soaked and begins to disintegrate slightly, even when no acid is perceptible. So, after a 90-minute test, or better yet before, raise the temperature 2, 4, 6, or 10 degrees, as your judgment warrants, and bring it to a firm consistency as quickly as possible. We are now supposed to be working spring or fall milk that is obstinately sweet and very hard to cook. In summer or warm weather, milk is, of course, mature. This aids and hastens the cooking process, while sweetness retards it. In cool weather and with good milk, having found that a minimum of 100 degrees will not cook the curd after standing at that temperature an hour and a half, fix your standard higher and bring it within the rule prescribed. Be sure that your curd is thoroughly cooked. Thousands of boxes of weak, half-raw cheese are thrown on the market every spring that are deficient in quality through a lack of heat at the vat. The most convenient and sure test of which I am aware to tell that the curd is done, so to speak, is to grasp a large double handful and compress it dry of whey. If it quickly, after pressure is withdrawn, falls easily apart on the palm of your outstretched hand, you may be sure that your curd is thoroughly cooked in every way. Now we come to acid. Acid. Acid microbes are inherent in the lacteal structure and come dormant in the milk from the udder. As soon as they feel the atmosphere, they spring into spontaneous activity, however retarded by cold or fostered by heat. Acid in milk is a species of yeast fermentation and is the first step toward decomposition. It is the best servant the cheesemaker has, and is also his worst enemy when the relation is changed to that of master. In a temperate climate, in hay-produced milk, in the spring of the year, acid is dormant, but there is but little use for it. Hay cheese are expected to be thrown on the market in cool weather, when they will be quickly consumed. Therefore, the additional firmness given by acid is not required to be applied as a safeguard against heat. If early hay cheese are cooked enough and salted about 2 pounds to the 1,000, it is all that is desirable. On the border between hay and grass, the weather is gradually moderating, and there is torrid temperature in sight in the immediate future. Acid now begins to appear in the whey and curd you are working by the time you have it scalded. It has a right to be there, for it is your friend, and you now need its timely proffered assistance. If, through unusually good quality of milk, it does not come to the front, coax it a little in the following way. After the curd is cooked and before whey is drawn, turn on steam and rewarm the whole mass. Then draw the whey and pack the curd in bulk as much as possible, covering it up with a cloth. This will soon set the acid to working in good shape. Always rely on the hot iron test to locate acid. I do not care for any acid to show, but on later April and beginning of May goods, acid should show on the hot iron clearly and perceptibly. When the curd is pressed to the metal, fine string should just start from it immediately prior to salting. At this time you will want just a little acid, but not too much. Too much will surely spoil spring-made cheese. The question arises, how far must a cheesemaker probe into the hidden mysteries that shroud the digestive assimilation of the product he manufactures? We answer that he cannot probe too deeply or extend his researches too far into the minute. There are too many makers now with only a superficial knowledge of their craft, and before there can be any perceptible elevation of quality in American cheese, the shoes of these novices must be filled by such men as we now term experts. Take, for example, the subject of acid which we are here discussing. A maker who can perceive it only as it is revealed by stringing on the iron is not competent to be in charge of a factory, for anybody could detect it there. The development of lactic acid is a species of fermentation induced by the spontaneous increase of inherent minute bacteria. It takes the same experience to perceive and govern it in the milk and cheese as it does practice with square and compass to become a carpenter. We cannot tell you all about it. It will take many days of careful observation and fine testing to understand its nature enough to make it your servant in the cheese-making art. That is why makers without practical experience are always incompetent. Hold curd in the whey until it shows at least 1/4 inch of acid by the hot iron, and then draw off whey as quickly as possible. It is always a good plan where you have large vats, and they are pretty well filled, to have 1/3 of the whey drawn off before acid develops, for then you can more quickly lay bare your curd. As the whey recedes, push the curd with the rake head toward the upper end of the vat, and then tip the vat down so that the whey will flow out from the lowest corner. Make a gutter with your hands through the center of the curd mass and distribute it in an even pack on each side of the vat. Now take a knife and cut it into strips 8 inches wide, drawing the knife from the center gutter toward the side of the vat. Flop these strips upside down, and to further facilitate drainage, cut a longitudinal canal next to the sides of the vat. Examine by the iron and see how the curd is working as to acid. If it is maturing slowly and the curd is not hot, shut off all drafts of air. Cut the curd into bricks or blocks the size of a brick and scatter them over the bottom of the vat. Then cover the vat up with the same cloth that you used when scalding. If, on the other hand, the curd is hot and maturing rapidly, cut into small bricks. Scatter well and give it all the air possible, frequently turning the bricks over. Unless positively unavoidable on account of overplus of acid, never grind curd until you have cooled it down to a temperature of 80 degrees. Above that heat, the fine texture of the curd is torn and mutilated so that it will give out white whey, and as a consequence, waste of quality and substance ensues. The curd being first well drained and cooled to 80 degrees by subdivision of pieces, and having also developed acid sufficient for the season, it is ready for the mill. Grind with deliberation, and if you have a self-salter, so much the better. Incorporate the salt into the curd by thorough, although not violent, mixing, and then air your curd. This is one of the most important processes of all, and yet the one most neglected by negligent makers. A curd requires airing, not so much to expel heat as to expunge the gaseous odors that have followed it down from its animal origin. Stir it well at frequent intervals and spread it out well over the surface of the vat. So calculate that it can lay 20 minutes or half an hour before it has sunk to the temperature of 70 degrees, when it is just right for the hoops. Allowing it to lay this length of time gives the salt an opportunity to strike into the pores and impregnate the product with its saline properties before being put under pressure. And with that, I think we'll end this evening's reading from the Handbook on Cheesemaking, which, given what I know about modern cheesemaking, is a pretty good explainer of the process. If you ever dreamed of running away to a farm and becoming a cheesemaker, this might be a good guide for you. If you'd like to read this work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.